RevOpsAF, the only podcast for people who are RevOpsAF and want to learn all about things that are RevOpsAF.
Our goal is to give the revenue operations community, that includes marketing, sales, and CS, for any of you not paying attention, the skills needed to accelerate their careers.
And today's episode is brought to you by Aligned. Here's a stat that RevOps won't love. 95% of the buyer journey happens when your sellers aren't in the room. So, how do you see what's actually going on? Well, with Aligned, that's how. Aligned is a collaborative buyer-facing deal workspace that gives you real-time visibility into buyer behavior, stakeholder activity, and deal momentum. See what buyers engage with, get instant CRM updates, spot hidden stakeholders, and forecast with confidence, all without changing your workflow. Try Aligned for free today at alignedup.com. Aligned is your deal room for buyer clarity and forecast confidence. Check them out at alignedup.com. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of RevOpsAF, the podcast, where we talk to people who are RevOpsAF about things that are RevOpsAF. I am your co-host, Matthew Volm, CEO and founder of RevOps Co-op, a global community of 16,000 plus revenue operators from all across the globe. And today I am sitting down with one of them, Benjamin Zeitz, who is the head of RevOps over at Sweep. And Sweep is an agentic workspace for Salesforce, but I'm going to let Benjamin actually tell us more about himself, his professional background, and just a little bit of Sweep, because that's going to set the stage for what we are ultimately talking about today, which is how you can grow and scale systems, process as your company grows and scales, and how you can inevitably rework or reevaluate things that you've already put in place. As Benjamin will share with us, none of us are perfect. We've all done things where we've had to roll them back, and there are right ways to do that and there are wrong ways to do that. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. But Benjamin, tell us a little bit more about yourself and Sweep as we get started here.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Excited for today's conversation. I'm sure it'll be lots of fun. Quickly about myself. I've been working in the RevOps space for about 10 years. We didn't always call it RevOps. I think in my first role, we even called it technology. But my role has always been to own the tech stack at a company, understand how the company operates, and help the company scale using technology. Started at insurance tech brokerage about 10 years ago called Founder Shield, with a pretty typical accidental admin story. I was an SDR on the customer success team. The team was about 7 or 8. I said to one of the co-founders, "It's really weird that you spend so much time in Salesforce. I think you would have more important things to do." And he's like, "You're right. This is yours now." And I said, "What?" From there, just started diving into the systems around me. I kind of automated away 90% of my SDR job. We didn't have proper sequencers back then, but I was able to kind of jigger together a few things like that. Worked at a company, bootstrap company, for 3-4 years, and it grew about 5x, which was a lot of fun. And then I joined a cybersecurity startup thinking I was going to be a Salesforce admin. That was kind of what I was signing up for. But the title was BizOps, and I thought, yeah, sure, same. The job description sounds Salesforce enough. I can handle it. First ops hire on a 20-person company that grew to 350, 400 employees, and about two and a half years that I was there. And that's really where I learned a lot about what we're going to talk about today, which is, going through hypergrowth, what needs to change. And for me back then, it wasn't just systems anymore. It was process. It was the impact it had on data. Coming up on 4 years ago now, I joined Sweep. So to just give a quick primer on Sweep, Sweep is an agentic workspace for Salesforce and HubSpot. What we do is we enable operators to scale their systems regardless of their level of technical expertise. We plug in and help you build scalable systems. Lately, really been leaning into AI agents to do that, to help you document your system, to help you find places where things are broken, to help you push off tickets and have your end users self-serve themselves, find places where maybe your system is under-optimized or underutilized, and identify places for improvement. So we're really leaning into using AI to help systems teams or help RevOps teams build for scale. And so that's what we'll talk about today. And so I've been with the team for about 4 years now, from pretty much from day one. And it's been a blast. It's a lot of fun and an amazing, amazing learning experience. So excited to share some of that today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I always love talking to revenue operators at companies that are building products and technology for operators. It's very meta. And so on that note, let's actually start with a story because as I mentioned and we kind of teed up, we're going to be talking about scaling systems, how to inevitably maybe roll things back or rework things that, maybe worked for you last month, last year, and they don't anymore. I'm sure we all have scars, stories of things that we've done or we've experienced that maybe didn't go as well on the reworking side. I know I have plenty, probably more, but we're not here to share my mistakes. I want to share your stories, Benjamin. So tell us, let's start with a quick story to kind of get us rolling. Tell us about a prior experience that you've had where maybe the rollback or the reworking of things hasn't gone ideally as planned.
Yeah. So I've actually got a bunch of stories, a bunch of war stories, launches that failed or flopped or need to be pulled back. But there's one that's been sticking out from very early in my career because it's particularly embarrassing. And the reason it's so embarrassing was it was just not a major rollout. It was something really innocuous. I was creating an alert. As one of the first things I did in Salesforce was creating an alert when something was closed won, and I was forwarding that email to our finance team. The thing about our finance team was they were outsourced. So they did not work in our company. Therefore, what I did makes is like 10 times worse. But when I rolled out the alert, I didn't test it properly. And I forgot, and this is in the days of workflow rules and process builders in Salesforce, I forgot to check a very important checkbox that says that this should only trigger when subsequent opportunities are moved to close one, or maybe you put an is changed in there. So I clicked a button, launched what I thought was a very simple alert, patted myself on the back, went to go get a glass of water when my phone started ringing that our outsourced accountant was getting thousands of emails nonstop over the last, let's call it 15 minutes at this point, and they weren't going to stop. And I kind of rendered their their inboxes worthless for a whole day. So they went out and they had beer. So I thought that was a good outcome. But when they told me that what they needed to deal with the next day, because they were pretty much behind a full day of work because I couldn't find any of their emails because I was spamming their inbox accidentally.
Yep.
Yeah, they weren't too pleased with me, but it was a good lesson in testing. It was a good lesson in thinking about outcomes. And, we'll talk about scaling today and reworking things today for sure. But this was just like something super simple that totally could have been avoidable with the right processes and technology in place.
Yeah. I have a similar story happened to me. Actually, this is probably like a year ago now, but we use HubSpot as our CRM and for marketing automation, all this other stuff. And they launched this new help desk functionality. And we have a shared inbox so that members and other people, if they need support, they can email this community at RevOpsCoop.com email address. Will help them. So I was like, oh, I want to see like if this help desk thing, what this is all about, right? So I like connected some things and kind of similar to you, I just like went through the flow, right? Did my thing. I was like, okay, cool. Let's see what happens. And then all of a sudden, I noticed tons of auto replies starting to come in to the community inbox. And what happened is kind of similar to you. It went back and said, okay, every email that you've ever received in this shared inbox, I'm going to create a ticket for and send a survey to those people about how their experience was. So now,
I mean,
like,
your NPS went through the roof.
yes, well, and people were getting so many, and I was like, oh my God, I need to figure out how to turn this off. And at first I was like, I saw some of these things coming through. I was like, oh, that's kind of weird. And then like someone else on my team was like, hey, like I'm getting all these emails, like what's going on? And then I looked and I was like, oh my God, like how do I undo this? How do I unwind it? So
And I find there's like a process that people go through when something like this happens. I've seen it myself and I've seen it in other people's faces. So I'm pretty familiar with it. First is like you watch the blood drain from their face. They realize that they really just messed something up pretty badly. And then next is just a moment of panic and they kind of freeze. And then you literally see their brain start going into overdrive. Like, what happened? What went wrong? How do I fix it? How do I stop the bleeding? That type of reaction comes from having been through it before.
happens to all of us. Well, good. I'm glad we're now bonded over some shared pain, some shared experiences. So let's talk first about this 1-3-10 rule as you kind of describe it. Tell us what that is and how that relates to process and change management.
Sure. And I want to give credit where credit is due. And I probably need to go back and find it. But I know exactly where I read this book, where I read about this rule, but I don't know who said it. So apologies to the genius who shared this. But I read this in Tools of Titans by Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss is a podcaster and he interviews tons of really, really interesting people. And so this came from one of the people he interviewed, whose name I'm currently forgetting. But he basically said that processes break down in multiples of 3 and 10. So what works for one person doesn't work for three. What works for three people doesn't work for 10, 10 to 30, 30 to 100, and so on. And so when you're thinking about reworking processes and, intrinsically processes tied with technology. So it's kind of like what I like to call the RevOps flywheel is like process, systems, data, right? So your process informs what your systems need to do. Your systems spit out data to tell you how your process is performing. Probably you're going to want to make changes to your process to capture some suboptimal things. You're probably going to need to rework your system and you kind of get this flywheel going. As teams are growing and they're hitting these milestones, you need to think about all of the processes they go through and understand what needs to change right now, what's working, what's not working. What I love about a startup, particularly for me, is like you have think of the company as a whole, right? You're hitting your 1, your 3, your 10, your 30, you're hitting these milestones, but also like as you hit these milestones and you're starting to think about, okay, well, here is how we do this as a company. You also have smaller, like each of the individual teams, like probably hitting those milestones too. So you have these like big overarching themes of like how your company operates, how your go-to-market operates. But now, your sales team just went from 10 to 30, let's say, or from 30 to 100. And you need to think about, okay, well, how does the company operate as a whole? But you also need to think about your sales team, which just went from 3 to 10 or 10 to 30 itself. And you need to think about, okay, well, if everything is changing for the sales team, if the process is changing for the sales team, how does that impact the grander processes and the grander scheme of things? And again, how that all ties back to systems and systems architecture. So for me, that's always where I start is like, it's not like a hard rule, like it's 10 people and then it happens. It could happen at 9, it could happen at 12, it doesn't matter. But typically as you start to approach these numbers, like your ears should be starting to perk up. You should be talking to your end users, particularly like the leaders of those teams, and saying like, what's working right now or what's no longer working right now, what's starting to break fray. And like personally just went through that with our team. Our team has gone through pretty decent growth. The team as a whole has grown nicely and there's been a lot of process change and systems change tied to it. Just making sure that as the teams scale, we can continue to support them as best as we can.
Yeah. No, it makes sense. Scaling is always a challenge. I know I've talked to a lot of people and, a lot of advice, feedback that you get out there is, hey, like move fast, break things, right? Like, get solutions kind of spun up quickly. Counter to that, you always hear a lot of people say, like try to build for future problems that you're going to have as you scale. So how do you think about building for maybe within the 1-3-10 framework, but how do you think about building out process, technology, data, those pieces that you mentioned to solve for where the company is currently at today versus where you hope or expect you'll be, obviously, as you grow and scale? And how do you think about making trade-offs there?
It's a very good question. Always build with an eye towards scale, but if you have a problem today, you need to solve it today, right? Like if you have a problem today because you built something for scale in the future, that's not ideal, right? We'll suffer with this for another year and a half until we hit the next milestone, and then this will really, really work. That's not an ideal scenario, and it's not what your team needs, and that will lead to low adoption, which will really compound your problems. So I always think you're solving for today's problems or you're solving to optimize for today with an eye towards the future. So you want to build things that will scale. They work today, but as you grow, they are flexible enough to change. And really, it's actually a core thesis that we have at Sweep. It was one of the earliest things that we discussed when I was joining, which is the problem that we started with when we started was Salesforce moves really slow. Systems move really slow, right? I'm like a head of sales. I have this great idea. We're going to change our whole go-to-market. We're going to train up the whole team and we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And it's going to take 2 weeks and we're ready to go. Then the systems team says, oh, it's going to take us about 3 months to implement all of the changes that you're talking about. We can pivot an entire sales team and change our approach and messaging. Why do the systems take so slow? One of the things we found at the core is the very basic floor of architecture in a lot of systems is flawed. When you're building on top of faulty, not steady infrastructure, you create dependencies and play this game of whack-a-mole where you change something here and it breaks something that seems totally unrelated over there, right? And so one of the things that Sweep was that we said is we were going to build something that was scalable so that as you build, if you need to change something, it's not going to bring the whole house crashing down, right? And so that was one of the things at the core of our thesis from a very early stage. Now, as far as that goes to building for the future, you need to make sure that core architecture is stable. And if your core architecture is not stable, you really need to rethink how those things are built and prioritize building that. Because if that is a strong, sturdy architecture, your systems will scale. So you really need to think about the most basic principles. If I'm going to speak in Salesforce terms for a second, it's how do we use opportunities? What do they represent? What are the core fields that are mapping back to our key data points? And this is a place where we've actually found AI to be really helpful, right? We're able to analyze orgs that work well, orgs that don't work well, understand why teams are successful, and we're able to share that as knowledge with end users, right? So when, somebody's asking AI like, okay, I want to understand conversion rates better through my funnel. Well, within our product, you can ask our process optimization agent, I'm having trouble measuring conversion rates. What should I do? And they'll say, well, okay, let's look at time stamping. Let's look at whether your stages are linear, whether people are keeping opportunities in, like, is my definition of stage one, your definition of stage one, making sure that we can define that properly. So these are our best practices that you can infuse into your architecture that create that stable ground floor that you can build upon. If you have a problem today, you can fix it and not be really worried about the trade-off of, well, what happens when we scale? Maybe we need to change something when we scale, but it's not like you're building bad architecture on top of bad architecture so that when we get to that point of scale, everything needs to be reworked from the ground up.
Yeah, it makes tons of sense. And that example that you gave becomes very clear how systems and things in, say, the old world could be very slow and hard to execute on those things, like conversion rates, for example. Again, you don't know what you don't know. And so having an agent that can kind of help you along there makes total sense. You mentioned that you've been at Sweep for like 4 years now. So I think I've seen things go from early, maybe pre-seed to seed to Series A. And now I think you all just raised your Series B. So what are, maybe as you're sitting in your seat today, I know you mentioned you're hiring, you're obviously growing. What are some of those growth or scaling challenges that you're facing today? And how are you thinking through those as it relates to the frameworks and the things that you've just talked a lot about, making those trade-offs, building for, flexibility as you go forward, even though you don't necessarily know, obviously, what the future will hold? How are you thinking about that and experiencing that today?
Yeah, it's a great question. And we just went through this, right? So for us, our sales team was relatively lean right before we raised our Series B. The sellers, hovering between 1 to 3 people, and SDRs hovering between 1 or 2 people. And it was very easy to just like sit, look at somebody, be like, do this. Here's why. The system will do XYZ for you, and you will do ABC, and then we'll have this clear, rosy, picture. And the communication was easy, and therefore like system adoption was really easy. And the people that were in the room were also all there for the evolution of how we got there. So they intuitively understood why they had to do things a certain way. So for us, like one of the ways that one of the places that I'm thinking about it is, how we handle like what some people might call like stage 0 opportunities, like how we measure things from demo scheduled to this is a qualified pipeline deal. And for us, we actually use the opportunity object for it, but it's an interesting approach that I really like.
I'll co-sign that. I like that.
Awesome. Well, so we found, a pain point in the process. We actually had a lot of people signing up for demos that were totally bogus, and maybe you can eyeball the email address. But I'll give an example where like Al Gore does work at Kleiner Perkins. We would love to sell to Kleiner Perkins, but I don't think Al Gore is signing up for a demo of Sweep. We were building processes around making sure that a new demo comes in, we capture it in our stage 0. Prior to considering it a proper demo, we do some discovery if we can, understand what's going on, and then we move it to the next proper demo scheduled stage, right? And we were rolling out this change as we hired 5, 6, 7, 8 people to the sales team. And so the process was new and unfamiliar to the people who had been there before, and it was new and unfamiliar to our newbies. The people that were there before understood the problem and why we were doing it. The people that were new were just like, okay, sure, that makes sense, but they've never felt the pain of the problem that I'm talking about. And so then the first thing I noticed were things that I would expect already to have been out of stage 0 and into demo scheduled. They weren't. So for me, that took a lot of, okay, we're going through an organizational change, and things that I could have just like verbally told people and would work. Now that's not the case. So for us, that looks like a process change. When we're rolling things out now, we want to make sure that we have a proper meeting, explain the why, understand how do we automate as much of the work away as possible so that, it's almost idiot proof without sacrificing the data that we need, that we're trying to understand, which from here is like, what percent of our demos are actually real? What percent of the real ones show up? What percent of the not, like what percent, as opposed to like just lumping everything together. We've got a no-show problem, it looked like, but it was like, okay, but these are people that I wouldn't expect to show up to a demo. So I'm not going to really invest my time, invest my follow-up, invest my SDR's time, like making sure that meeting happens when it's like not qualified. So I think from like a scaling standpoint, that was like the perfect lesson, which is again, like what worked for 1 didn't work for 3, or what worked for 3 doesn't work for 10, which is like rolling out processes, right? Making technological changes and making sure that they're adopted correct. So I can tie so much back to like the process change. And then from like a systems architecture standpoint is making sure like, okay, well, from like a data, like I had to tie it back to the data. And I think that was like a really important, it's a really important thing to call out, which is like when you're making process changes, when you're making systems changes, you need to be aware of their impact on the data, right? So we were measuring our scheduled to held rate. Well, now we're taking things that we used to consider scheduled and we're not considering them scheduled. How does that tie into our reporting? How does that tie into the way that we talk about demos? How does that tie into our top of our weekly like pipeline gen meeting? Like, did we have 28 demos last week, or did we book 28 demos last week, or did we book 14? Because a bunch of them are still in stage 0. Are they real or are they not? I don't know. Right. So all of this one small systems change led to a lot of process change, a lot of data change. You really need to understand the ramifications of what it is that you're doing. And for me, that always ties back to documentation. And with Sweep, like it's really simple, but hey, I'm making a change here. What are the downstream impacts? What touches these automations? What touches these fields that I'm playing with? Where are those fields used in reporting? And just making sure that I have the full picture of the change that I'm going to make. If I have the full picture of the change that I'm going to make, then hopefully this change goes really smoothly. It's less of a game of whack-a-mole because I have seen all of the things I need to be aware of, and I have thought about all of the things I need to be aware of before I make the change.
And last question or kind of topic area I have for you is you've obviously lived, for folks who might be listening to this, where maybe these frameworks, the 1-3-10 rule, this way of thinking might be new. What specific advice or feedback would you give to them? Or better yet, put yourself in their shoes. Let's say you're hearing all of this stuff for the first time and now you're at maybe a new company who's facing these scaling challenges. Where would you start? What would be the things that you would do? Is it going out and building documentation? Is it taking a look under the hood at certain things? Like what would be those things that you would do? What would you recommend to other people?
It's a good question. I think the baseline is you need to understand what you're working with. So if there's existing documentation, amazing. If you're using Sweep, even more amazing, like fully documenting your org, using AI really quickly, getting all of like understanding all of the dependencies in your org. Like that is the baseline. Like if I'm starting something new, that's where I'm starting. I'm making sure I understand what's the technical architecture and what's the process, making sure do those two things match. Now from there, you're ready to make changes and things like that. Understanding, again, like mapping it back to the data, understanding like the impacts that you're going to have is really, really important. Proposing a change and getting buy-in. So working with leadership, working with end users, understanding their pain points and building towards, like I said before, fixing those pain points with an eye towards scale. Build something that solves a problem today or unlocks value today with an eye towards how it's going to work in the future. And then test, like push to a sandbox. Pull in your power users, the people that seem to adopt things well, and like nothing railroads a project like, hey, I built this whole amazing thing. I'm doing my grand reveal. And they're like, okay, but you forgot about this. And none of this is going to work because you forgot about it. So making sure that you bring in, like, it's not just that you've tested and QA'd things and make sure that it works, but that you've gotten the opinion of the people that are in the role day to day, because there might be part of their job that you are overlooking, don't even know about, that impacts everything that you're building. And as part of this, like working with power users, making sure you have a visual, again, something I like to use Sweep for, but like making sure you have a visual, clear way of articulating to them what it is you've built, how it ties back to their process, and why it matters, right? So whether that's a flow chart or a slide deck that it's explaining, like, here's the process, here's the problem we're solving, here's how we're solving it and why it matters to you, and here is what to expect. Like making sure that you have that visual, and also like tying it back to, look, well, and here's the technical underneath, and here's how we're doing it. You don't need to share the technical with the end users. That's for you. That's for the next time you need to make a change. And then lastly, and most importantly, I know this is a checklist of rolling out something new. It's really important, is making sure you have a rollback plan. I didn't have a rollback plan when I created that alert. That ruined some people's days. If you're building something new, you need to understand either how to turn on a kill switch or how to revert back to the way that things were 20 minutes ago or an hour ago or whatever it was yesterday, so that you don't interrupt the business because you made a mistake. Because you will make mistakes, not a mistake. You will make mistakes along the way. And sometimes you left out a comma and now it looks like the world is burning and you just need to go and find that comma. But if you're able to just move back, like roll back and go back to where you were before, and give you time to figure that out without the world burning, it makes you less gray. And I'm starting to see the grays in my hair. I get it. And then just one other like practical thing that I like to say is, if you're going live with something, make sure you're not booked up with meetings that whole day. Because if you need to jump on something quickly, but you're meeting your boss at that time or meeting a customer at that time, you want to make sure that, you're all hands on deck to troubleshoot, to fix, hot fix, whatever it is. Just make sure that you're available. So I think if I was, those are like, each one of those points comes with a painful story, I think, where I learned this the hard way. But if I were saying somebody's coming new to an org, they're hearing these parts of the framework for the first time, these are the things that you need to know to do. You can do this without a framework. You could do it with a framework, but you need to have these steps in place. Without like the 1, 3, 10, you need to have this playbook ready to go, so that if you're going ahead, building, making changes, you have a path to a smooth rollout.
Yeah, 100%. And those last 2 points you mentioned on, call it having a kill switch, or a really simple ability to just revert back to, call it your prior version, and making sure that you're not booked up with meetings. I'll go back to my example that I gave you at the very beginning. Not only did I want, obviously, like not have the kill switch or the rollback period figured out, but I also did all these things in like a couple of minutes before I jumped into a bunch of meetings. And so then I was multitasking, telling people I needed to go to like figure out what on earth I was doing here. So, all right, Benjamin, I have one more one more question for you. It's not RevOps related, and I did not tell you that I was going to ask you this question. So truly getting your off the cuff sort of remarks here. As you know, we held our RevOpsAF conference a few weeks back in New Orleans. Danny from your team was there. We had a lot of Sweep customers there as well. We're doing a European version of our event in a few weeks in Berlin as well. And we're going to continue to do this stuff every single year. I want you to imagine that you are the opening keynote speaker for RevOps AF, and we call your name and you are entering stage left. What would be the walk-up song that you would play as you walked onto stage to deliver the opening keynote for RevOps AF?
What a question. I could go 2 totally different routes. The first, because like I love late 90s, early 2000s pop. It's something that some people tell me I should be embarrassed about, but I'm really not. I might go with like a Bye Bye Bye, just because I like the vibes. But I also had, when I used to play baseball, my walk-up music was always Bring 'Em Out by T.I. Just the beginning. Don't need the whole song, but just that first pro verse always gets me hyped. So that might be it.
I like them. Those are both good choices. I fully respect and own the late 90s, early pop. I'm also into emo music from the early 2000s as well. So like, which I guess now is technically people are considering that like classic rock and stuff. We don't need to get into that situation now and talk about how old we're feeling. But with that, Benjamin, thank you very much for dropping some knowledge. We went all the way from how to roll back things, how to think about growing and scaling systems as your company grows and matures, to ending with NSYNC and TI. So I think we've truly covered it all, my friend, but thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining today.
Thanks so much for your time. Thanks for having me. This was a blast.
Thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode, everybody.
For more great content like this, join our community at RevOpsCoop.com and check out the links provided in the show notes.
Keep it RevOpsAF, y'all.